What's going on, Alex Bros? It's Mr. C here, and in this video what I'm going to do is show you how to enter data into the graphing calculator as well as construct a scatter diagram for the data. Alright, let's get started. So we're going to be using this data which compares advertising expenditures to sales. And just a quick note on that, this is a table from the textbook, and in the description of the problem it states that each of these values is in terms of thousands. So for the first row of values, if $20,000 is spent on advertising, then the company is seeing $335,000 in sales. And for the second row, if $22,000 is spent in advertising, then the company sees $339,000 in sales. Excuse me. All right. So with that out of the way, have our graphing calculator on. What we're going to do is press the Stat button. And in this menu, the one that we want to be in, we want to select option 1, Edit. So you can either press 1 or Enter. And it should bring up three columns or three lists. Here's list 1, list 2, and list 3. If any of these are missing, feel free to reach out to me. I'll show you how you can get them back up in your graphing calculator. So what we want to do is basically just use list 1 and list 2. And you have to be careful as to which values you use in these because essentially one of these lists will represent your x values, whereas the other list represents your y values. The way to decide is to figure out what your independent variable is and what your dependent variable is. So you do have to kind of take a step back and think about that for a moment. If we look at the table, you want to decide what depends on what. You know, would the advertising depend on the sales, or would the sales depend on the advertising? So all things considered, I would say that the more the company that spends on advertising, the more sales they would expect to see. Of course, there are exceptions to that, but my point being is typically we would see the sales depending on the amount of advertising. What that means for our purposes is that these values would represent the values that go into L1. They would represent the independent variable, whereas the sales values are going to be the values we enter into L2, and those would represent values of the dependent variable. So what we'll do is in our graphing calculator, we'll enter each one of these values in individually. I typically do the values in L1 first and then do the values in L2. So our first value going in L1 is 20, so type in 20 and press enter. Then 22, enter. 22.5, enter. Pair of 24s. 27, and then 28.3. Make sure you press enter on the last value in each of the lists. That way your calculator saves it in the list. To get over to L2, I'm just going to hit the right arrow key and start typing these numbers in. Alright, I always kind of scroll back up through the list, double check that all the x values line up with the corresponding y values from the table. So for example, 20 appears to be lined up with 335, 22 with 339, so on and so forth. And I also check to see if I'm missing any digits in any of these values. So for instance, maybe I'm rushing entering in the value of 350 and I accidentally typed that in as 35. that's actually going to throw off some of the values in some of these answers. So you got to be careful about um, entering in your data carefully. All right. So what I'm going to do next is help you set your graphing calculator to be ready to create a scatter diagram. So what we can do from here is press second y equals, and by doing that we're accessing the stat plot menu, and this is where we're going to set our graphing calculator to plot the table of values as a scatter diagram. We're primarily just going to be using the first option here, plot 1. You'll notice that it says off. What we're going to do is press enter, and it takes us into all the different settings that there are for plot 1. Um, as for the type, X list, Y list, and the marking, the default settings are normally pretty good for us, so I don't typically change these. But obviously the thing that we do want to change is we don't want it to say off anymore. We want it to be highlighted on. And you can just press enter, and it takes care of that for you real quickly. So plot 1 is currently on. And before we see the scatter diagram on our graphing calculator, what I want to do is take us to the y equals menu and point out a couple of things. The first thing is that there's an equation in y1 already. So if there's any equations in y1 or y2 for you, you want to make sure that those are cleared. That way they're not showing up on the scatter diagram and causing any confusion. So I'm seeing y1 equals 2x plus 5 in my y equals menu, so I'm going to hit the clear button to get rid of that. But another thing that you should be noticing is that plot 1 is highlighted in black. So that's a tall tale sign that your graphing calculator is set to plot data. So what I want to do next is just hit zoom option 6, so the standard viewing window, and when you do that, nothing on the coordinate plane is provided. So you're not really seeing any of those dots or anything like that. No signs of a scatter diagram, and that's kind of intentional because I want to take you to a different zoom setting. But the reason why we're not seeing any data points on our viewing window is because you got to remember, with the standard viewing window, it only goes from -10 to +10 on both axes, and all these values in the table fall beyond +10. So that's why we're not seeing any of the data. So one way of seeing the data is to just kind of guess and check with different window settings. But fortunately, the developers of the calculator were able to program a special zoom setting to where all of the data values will be displayed at once in the same viewing window. So to access that special zoom setting, you're going to press the zoom key and scroll all the way down to option 9, where it says zoom stat. And this is basically a zoom feature for our statistics. So go ahead and press enter, and in just a snap you can see our scatter diagram that the graphing calculator provides for us based on the data in this table. So when it comes down to it and you're being asked to sketch or provide a sketch of a scatter diagram, you're going to do your best to just draw out what your graphing calculator is displaying for you. So I'll do the best I can here. I'm going to draw quadrant 1. And keep in mind that the X values represent all the different advertising amounts. So I'm going to label the X-axis as capital A for advertising and the Y-axis as capital S for sales. And basically all I'll do from here is just sketch out those little boxes that are supposed to serve as those circular points as best as I can in their relative location with respect to the graphing calculator viewing window. All right, and that would be definitely sufficient for me in terms of providing a sketch of the scatter diagram of this data. Just kind of a throwback to page 1, you'll notice that the points kind of flow in a linear fashion. Generally speaking, as we go from left to right, the points are increasing and sort of follow a linear pattern, but obviously not a perfect linear pattern. So in the next video, what I'm going to do is discuss how we can use our graphing calculators to come up with a linear equation that kind of best represents this data, or can be used to predict some of the values in the table and beyond. So I'm going to cut the video off here. Of course, if you have any questions whatsoever about what we've done in this video, feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.